Well, would you just like to start by introducing yourself?
Yes, I'm Carole Stewart, and currently I work for a local authority. I'm Director of Communities, so I work for an Inner London authority. Very busy portfolio, which includes kind of culture and the arts right through to community safety and public protection. But I've always had, from the very start of my working life, a passion for the arts and creativity, and all of my job roles have had an aspect of that as key to what I do, as part of who I am.
So that comes to the question of how you got involved then with Chisenhale Dance Space back in the mid-1980s.
Yeah, a long time ago. I moved to London in the mid-80s. I studied at Essex University in Colchester, and most of the people I knew had a London connection. I think many Londoners at that time didn't go very far to study, and I went to Essex. And I came into London, and I did an interim role covering for someone in Tower Hamlets. So I worked at the time for Tower Hamlets Association for Racial Justice, and I was doing that for about 4 or 5 months. And in that time, I got involved with the housing co-op movement. There was a real issue in terms of particularly Black people having access to housing via the council's waiting list. And it was the time when there was a real commitment to social action, people taking kind of control of their own destiny, if you like. And short life properties were made available for housing cooperatives made up of local people who would basically self-manage with some expert advice the conversion of those properties into suitable accommodation, with the view to then moving from short life housing, those properties from short life housing to more permanent developed housing units. So through working with Tower Hamlets Association for Racial Justice and being in on the ground floor in terms of the housing co-op movement in Tower Hamlets at the time, that's how I ended up with that strong commitment to the borough. And it was through the housing co-op that I came across Chisenhale. And it kind of lit a spark for me, really, because I suppose a number of things I should say. One is that there was a property along the canal that we were looking at the same time as a short life property, which then got converted into permanent housing unit, which wasn't too far from Chisenhale. So we were in close proximity. One of the things that I did as part of the housing co-op was I was chair for a number of years, and we agreed to host a fundraising event, a community awareness event, and we did that at Whitechapel Art Gallery. And I suppose a number of things kind of triangulated there. I do remember that there ended up being a link. I think it was because of the kind of work that we were doing. It was the housing social action, getting something set up from the ground up. I suppose now you'd call it, I don't know, you might call everyone who was operating in the space at that time as social entrepreneurs, both the team at Chisenhale, the team working on Lakai Housing Co-op and other activity around the borough. But at the time we didn't have that name. It was just that stuff needed to be done. We just got on and did it. And through that, they then developed kind of a network of people who were doing stuff. And I think because our co-op was very much focused on meeting the needs of Tower Hamlets kind of Black communities who were being underserved, and Chisenhale being what was in effect sort of seen as sort of a white middle class sort of enclave, wanting to reach out into communities, there just seemed to be a natural fit. And I suppose with me being that kind of passion around kind of the arts and stuff, it was just an easy connection to make. At that time, as I transitioned from working for Tower Hamlets for Racial Justice, I then did a short stint at Tower Hamlets, and then I got my permanent job with Oval House Theatre in Kennington in 1983, 84. So I suppose the planks or the different strands are, one, I started off, I had that connection with Tower Hamlets through Tower Hamlets, which was THARD, Tower Hamlets Association for Racial Justice. I needed somewhere to live myself because I'd come in from outside of London, although I had quite strong connections with Tower Hamlets. But in the day job, working in the arts in South London, and Oval House was very much a space where kind of arts and social action were very closely aligned. And my role in Oval House was I can't remember what my title was, but basically I was responsible for coordinating the workshop programme. Oval House, it's a theatre space, it was kind of very radical at the forefront of LGBTQ work, working with artists from the African diaspora. So there were a lot of refugee artists coming in, artists in exile coming into that space. And I was coordinating the workshops. And there was also an opportunity to establish a sort of a community program. There wasn't anyone to do that, so I stepped into the space and did the programming. So all of those things came together to enable positive conversations with the team at Chisenhale. It wasn't just coming in from a housing perspective and the developments along the canal, but also I knew and understood the role of arts in the community. And I suppose the space was absolutely known for the cabaret performances, and that for me was the first time I saw Jenny Clare, who was doing her very first, trialing her craft, and also Julian Clary, but at the time he was Joan Collins' fan club with his little dog. So it's really interesting because I remember the cabarets, every time I see or hear of their work over the years, I always go back to the opportunities they had then to really, work their craft in that environment.
Yeah, it's interesting that's something that really sticks in your mind, because obviously they were called Chisenhale Dance Space, but they were doing much more than that. They had these cabaret nights, and they had craft fairs, and all sorts of things going on in that space. That they were kind of crossing over that boundary between an art space and a sort of community venue in some ways with the work that they were doing. There's lots of summer schools that they were running, and Mary and Chris in particular were working off-site a lot. So they worked at Saxon Hall, the Montefiore Centre. So all of those places across the borough, some of which probably you were working in as well, I suppose, around that time.
Because Saxon Hall was where I think the Saxon Youth Club.
Yes, they worked with Saxon Youth Club. Yeah. And
Saxon Youth Club, the person who ran Saxon Youth Club was also involved in Lakai Housing Co-op.
Right.
So that was one of the other connections, because Saxon Hall was in E3, and Lakai is the kind of French patois word for house and home, and so we had lots of discussions in Saxon Hall about the naming of the co-op, and given that the majority of people of Caribbean descent in Tower Hamlets were from the Eastern Caribbean, so they were either from Dominica or St. Lucia, where, the national language is English, but there is a French patois that is spoken on the island, and hence, and Stan, I think his name was, they were from St. Lucia, and it was agreed to call it the Kai Housing Co-op, which is different in terms of sort of the Eastern Caribbean to sort of the west side, where kind of Jamaica and some of the other islands are. So that's also another connection.
Interesting. And you mentioned the cabaret nights. Is there anything else that you kind of remember about the space, or things that you saw, or things that you did in the space? Did you ever host events with the housing co-op at Chisenhale? Or
I'm not sure. I think we probably had meetings there, but the main venue I remember us using is at the Whitechapel. Yeah. And I think we did that because it was just, they were great partners. I think Jenny Lomax was there at the time, not too sure. But they were right next to the tube station. And for them, it was the very first time they did anything like that as well. What I remember is I did a photo shoot there a friend was developing his photography technique, and so I was the model with my head wrap and my big earrings as part of that. So, sometimes I wonder, and because how sometimes you do things and you then almost have a sort of a photographic sort of imprint on your mind, or a film freeze in your mind of a place and how it smelled and how it felt. And that was the feeling I had in Chisenhale. So I remember the brick walls, and just the opportunity just to use all of this space for movement and photography, which was great.
Yeah, amazing. You've touched on this a bit, but I wonder if you had to describe what Chisenhale was at that time in the 80s, how would you describe it?
I've always thought about it as an arts space as opposed to a dance space. Although obviously it is Chisenhale Dance Space, and I know that and knew that, but because it was so accessible in terms of the cabaret, and also in terms of if the community wanted to use it, and it was a creative space, and I do remember the team there at the time just being very open. So I don't know if that describes it as such, but I think I think it was also a product of the time as well, in terms of getting the capital to invest in a space like that, and also because, as you said, it was a time when people could have a dream and turn that dream into a reality by just working as a collective. And in many ways make the rules up as you go, because there wasn't necessarily a template. And I know it's not that easy to do that now, because one, the buildings aren't there, and there are so many kind of rules and tram lines that people have to operate in now, that ability to quickly get something off the ground is much harder. And because there wasn't a template, you could take risks. And if it didn't quite work, you could flex and do something else. And I know that there's a lot of talk in terms of community activism now to be agile and give people space to work. But it's, even when you read some of the material now or hear some of the narrative, it's still more structured than I remember it being at that time.
Yeah, it was a really creative time, I think, as well, and it still is in the borough. But there were lots and lots of artists living there, both that had always been there, but also artists that had moved there, because, like you say, there was just all the empty housing that you could actually get into and live there.
That was the case all over London, because a number of, I remember some of the staff team at Oval House were living in squatted properties around Kennington Park. And there was, from my time working in Hackney as assistant director for culture, responsible for culture there are lots of people who I've come across who are living in Hackney who originally were squatters in Hackney. And when I was working in Oval House, some of the staff were squatting in Hackney. Do you know what I mean? So that was what was happening. You need somewhere to live, and somebody says to you, well, there's a space in our house, but actually there are no floorboards to the toilet. There's just a plank. It's that kind of thing that you never do now, because it wasn't safe, but it was bit Wild West, but good, because you just had the space to think and do and be creative.
Yeah, exactly.
I do think that I do really appreciate this conversation, because as we've been talking and hearing more about your research, there is just so much that has been done over the years that has acted almost as a foundation for a lot of stuff, a lot of kind of art and creative stuff that's happening now that's just got lost. And we're not the best at documenting our histories, so it's really great that you're doing this research.
It's so interesting just being able to situate what people were doing that were involved in Chisenhale, what else they were doing. So hearing about the cult that you were involved with and how you even got there, and it just gives a really full picture of what was going on elsewhere outside the borough as well, and what it was kind of like at that time.
And that is just an interesting point that you made about this sort of network of organisations and people who were working across London. But it's the same people searching out, I suppose, common ground where they can do stuff, as you say, people rehearsing at Chisenhale, performing at Oval House. They're probably the same group of people who then moved on to the Drill Hall and other places.
Yeah, Drill Hall's come up lots of times. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so it's really interesting, isn't it, when you kind of take a moment to reflect back on it, and then you realise how these kind of networks are formed, and your part in it as well, as part of that network, kind of touching in these different organisations.
And now I think where I started and where I've ended up as kind of director for communities in Camden, it's quite a journey. So I suppose the sort of the plus that I've got from this conversation, it's just allowed me to think about that journey, and also the touch points and the kind of the energy that you have along that kind of career path. And I do feel that I've been really privileged really to have had the journey that I've had, and even now as a director in Camden, being responsible for kind of culture and the arts, still, yes, in a more strategic way, but still working with creative, dynamic people in kind of radical settings. That's fantastic.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and also it's really inspiring. Great, thank you very much for talking to me.
No, thank you.